Hey everyone, this is a piece by Leon Trotsky. It's from January 1933. It's titled The Danger of Thermidor, an analysis of the significance of Stalin's latest speech. I'm getting this from Marxist.org. The Soviet regime rests on the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. The proletariat constitutes the minority of the population, the peasantry the overwhelming majority. Yet in the hands of the proletariat are the most concentrated means of production. The forces of the peasantry, on the contrary, are split up through their economic relations. Still more, it is not a homogeneous group. As long as there is no thoroughgoing change in technique and economy in the village, and for this even under the most favorable circumstances, the work of a whole generation would be needed. The peasantry will crystallize out of its stratum of kulaks, which inevitably strives towards capitalism. The mechanical destruction of the present kulaks decides nothing. After the alleged, quote, liquidation of the kulaks as a class, unquote, the Soviet press constantly keeps complaining, having gone over from materialism to idealism, since bureaucrats are always idealists, of the power of the kulak, quote, ideology, end quote, of the remains of kulak psychology, etc. In fact, behind these complaints is hidden the fact that the middle class of peasants, although locked up into kolkhozes, faced with the present level of technique and economy, sees no other way out for itself than to lift itself up to the level of the kulaks. New section. What the peasant demands. In the October upheaval, two revolutions were interlaced: the end of the democratic one and the beginning of the socialist. By doing away with lease payments, the democratic revolution saved the peasantry almost 500 million gold rubles. The fruits of the socialist revolution are valued by the poor peasants according to the quantity of industrial products which he can obtain in exchange for a given quantity of goods. The peasant is no utopian. The peasant does not demand that socialism be built up in one country and in 5 years at that. But he does demand that socialist industry deliver him goods under conditions which are no worse than those of capitalist industry. Under these conditions, the peasant is prepared to extend an unlimited credit in political confidence to the proletariat and its party. The Soviet state would receive the possibility of maneuvering according to the internal conditions in the world situation, and of drawing the peasantry into socialist economy. The basis of mass collectivization can only be the equivalent exchange of the products of industry and agriculture. Without going into the theoretical economic hair-splitting, we must regard as, quote, equivalent such an exchange as will stimulate the peasants, individual as well as collectivized, to till as much land and harvest as much grain as possible, send the greater part to the city in order to obtain for it as large a quantity of industrial products as possible. Only such reciprocal economic relations between city and country, what Lenin called the, quote, smichka, can free the workers' state from the necessity of taking forcible measures against the village to compel the exchange. Only from the moment when the voluntary exchange is assured will the proletarian dictatorship be unshakable. The, quote, smichka, thus secured, means the closest political alliance of the poor peasantry and the urban workers, the firm support of the decisive masses of the middle peasantry, and consequently the political isolation of the kulaks and of all capitalist elements in the country in general. The, quote, smichka, thus secured, means the unshakable loyalty of the Red Army to the proletarian dictatorship, which, in view of the successful industrialization and unlimited human, largely peasant reserves, will make it possible for the Soviet state to repulse any imperialist intervention. As the left opposition has declared since 1923, industrialization is the prerequisite for the march towards socialism. Without a rising industrialization, neither linen nor nails, not to speak of tractors, can be supplied to the peasants. But industrialization must be carried through at such a tempo and in accordance with plans that the relation of the quantity of goods between city and village will steadily, if slowly, improve, and the standard of living of workers and peasants rise. This foremost condition of the stability of the whole regime limits the permissible tempo of industrialization and collectivization. New section. Back to war communism. It means nothing to add, quote, has the 5-year plan abolished classes and introduced socialism, end quote. But we must unquestionably ask, quote, has it assured the, quote, smitchka between city and country, end quote? The answer is, quote, no, it has shaken and weakened it, end quote. In his last speech at the plenum of the Central Committee, Stalin boasted that the planned collectivization had been exceeded 3 times over. But who needs these figures outside of the bureaucratic boasters? The statistics of collectivization do not take the place of bread. The coal causes are numerous, but there is no meat and no vegetables. The city has nothing to eat. Industry is disorganized because the workers are hungry. In its relation to the peasant, the city has passed from a semi-voluntary exchange through a tax in kind to compulsory expropriations, that is, the methods of wartime communism. The hungry workers are dissatisfied with the policies of the party is dissatisfied with the leadership, the peasantry is dissatisfied with industrialization, with collectivization, with the city. Part of the peasantry is dissatisfied with the regime. What part? We cannot know, but it is clear that under present circumstances it can only grow. Quote, the planned collectivization has been exceeded 3 times over, end quote. But that is precisely the misfortune. The forced coal causes not only do not lead to socialism, but on the contrary undermine the foundations of the dictatorship of the proletariat by becoming the organized form of the strike of the peasants against the city. By hiding its grain from the state or purposefully limiting its seeding, the peasantry places itself on the road of the kulaks. Quote, permit me, it says, quote, to buy and sell at will, end quote. From whom and to and from the one who offers the right prices, whether it be a state, a private dealer, a foreign capitalist. The peasant strike for the freedom of internal trade leads immediately to the demand for the abolition of the monopoly of foreign trade. That is the logic of the mistakes of the 5-year plan. In his speech, Stalin gave the summary. As to this, we shall speak in a separate article, but in planned economy, the statistical balance sheet corresponds to the economic balance sheet only in case the plan is correct. A plan full of mistakes, on the contrary, can comprise or even annul the great successes. The 5-year plan has brought enormous gains in technique and in production. But the 5-year plan's economic results are extraordinarily contradictory. As far as the political balance sheet is concerned, it shows an open and very great deficit. But politics is condensed, concentrated economy. Politics is decisive. A socialist reconstruction, which drives a wedge between the worker and the peasant and sows dissatisfaction among the proletariat, is a lying construction. No figures can change this objective estimation. The real balance is not given on the pages of the newspapers, but in the fields of the peasants, in the barns of the kolkhozes, in the warehouses of the factories, in the dining rooms of the workers, and finally, in the heads of the workers and the peasants. Through all its zigzags, its delays, its forward leaps, bureaucratic centrism has not strengthened the dictatorship of the proletariat, but on the contrary has increased the danger of Thermidor. Only cowards can fear to name this result out loud. Facts are stronger than words. In order to struggle against inimical facts, we must call them by their right names. We must also call those responsible by their names, Stalin and his clique. Why do we speak precisely of Thermidor? Because it is the best known and most complete historical example of a masked counter-revolution, which still contains the outward forms and the ritual of revolution, but which already changes the class content of the state. Here the clever ones will interrupt us to show their cleverness. Quote, in 18th century France, it was a question of a bourgeois revolution. In 20th century, of a proletarian revolution. Social conditions have changed considerably. The world situation has changed, etc., etc. With such commonplaces, any Philistine takes on an appearance of extraordinary profundity. For us, too, the difference between the October Revolution and the Jacobin Revolution is no mystery. But that is no reason for turning one's back on history. Lenin wrote in 1903 that the Bolsheviks are Jacobins who are inseparably bound up with the working class. At that time, I replied to Lenin explaining in detail the difference between Marxist and Jacobin. My remarks, correct in themselves, completely failed of their purpose. Lenin knew well that Marxist and Jacobin are not the same thing, but it was necessary for a definite reason for Lenin to point out the features which they have in common. Without such methods, one can learn absolutely nothing from history. In the same sense in which Lenin called the Bolsheviks the proletarian Jacobins, we can detect in the reaction against the dictatorship of the proletariat features of Thermidor. Not every counter-revolution can be compared with Thermidor neither. Kornilov or Kolchak or Lenikin nor Wrangel had anything in common with Thermidor. In all these cases, it was a question of an armed struggle of capitalists and landowners to restore their domination. The danger was repulsed by the proletarian state. Can this danger rise up again? As an independent factor, scarcely. The Russian big bourgeoisie has been destroyed to the roots. The surviving remains could appear on the stake only as the tail end of a foreign military intervention or of Thermidor. All the past counter-revolutionary movements in the Soviet Union, the Kronstadt Rebellion of March 1921 is the closest to Thermidor in type. Of all the past counter-revolutionary movements in the Soviet Union, the Kronstadt Rebellion of March 1921 is the closest to Thermidor in type. All the proletarian elements of the Kronstadt garrison had been removed during the 3 preceding years for the purposes of Soviet construction and the Civil War. The best of them had been destroyed. On the ships and in the barracks remained only the immature, half-starved peasant elements. Many of these sailors considered themselves as Bolsheviks, but they did not want the commune. They were for the Soviets, but without communists. That's not actually true. It's what they wanted was free elections to the Soviets, not forced Communist Party hegemony over the Soviets. Anyway, I have a lot of pieces on here about the nature of Kronstadt, which contradicts very much what Trotsky is saying here. It was the rebellion of the injured, dissatisfied peasantry which had lost its patience against the dictatorship of the proletariat. If the petty bourgeoisie had won, it would have shown its bankruptcy the next day, and its place could only have been taken by the big bourgeoisie. Under the conditions of the present day, that is, of the 20th and not of the 18th century, years would not have been necessary for this. Months, even weeks, would have sufficed. The petty bourgeois counter-revolution, which still honestly regards itself as revolution, which does not want the domination of capitalism, but invariably prepares it, that is Thermidor. The petty bourgeois counter-revolution, which still honestly regards itself as revolution, which does not want the domination of capitalism, but invariably prepares the domination of capitalism, that is Thermidor. In the Soviet Union, only the peasantry can become a Thermidorian power. For this, it is necessary that it seriously separate itself from the proletariat. The destruction of the normal relations between city and village, the administrative collectivization, the compulsory expropriation of agricultural products confront the peasantry with the Soviet state now no less sharply than in the winter of 1920-21. It is true that the proletariat is now numerically much stronger. Therein lies the success of industrialization. But the proletariat is completely deprived of an active, watchful party capable of action. The apparent party is without a Marxian leadership. On the other hand, the peasantry has acquired an organization for resistance against the Soviet state in the form of the kolkhozes. The abolition of the Smichka, which is beginning to be formed, threatens to break the political alliance between proletariat and peasantry. Precisely therein lies the source of the danger of Thermidor. We must not represent the matter to ourselves in such a way that the break must be marked by a very exact social line. On the one side the peasants, on the other the workers. The peasant masses surround and interlock with the proletariat from all sides. In the proletariat itself there are millions who have just come from the village. Finally, the open mistakeness of the policies of the leadership, the shipwreck of bureaucratic adventurism, the absence of a clear orientation, the absolute choking off of workers' democracy, all this makes even the genuine worker accessible to the pressure of petty bourgeois ideology. Therein lies the second source of danger of Thermidor. But we also must not think that the line of fracture will have to go somewhere between the party on the bod. I think it says on the one hand. There's a lot of typos. But we must also not think that the line of fracture will have to go somewhere between the party on the one hand and the peasantry and a part of the working class on the other. No, the line of Thermidor would inevitably have to pass through the party itself. In his will, Lenin wrote, quote, "Our party is supported by two classes. For this reason, an upset of its stability is possible, and if no agreement between both classes can exist, the breakdown of the party is inevitable. In such a case, no measure could prevent a split. But I confidently expect such a possibility will prove too remote, such an event too improbable, to need to be discussed." End quote. Lenin. Lenin in those days expressed the certainty that 10 to 20 years of correct policy toward the peasantry would assure the victory of the proletarian revolution on the world scale. Precisely for this reason, Lenin thought, and we all did too, that the perspectives of Thermidor were not only too far off, but also highly improbable. Of the 10 to 20 years indicated by Lenin, 10 have already passed. On the field of the international revolution, the Comintern during this period has reaped only defeats. Today, in spite of the exceptionally favorable objective conditions, communism and consequently the international revolution is weaker than at the time when Lenin wrote his will. In addition, the danger of a split between the two classes on which the dictatorship in the USSR rests has been extraordinarily acute. In spite of the great difficulties, there is nothing in the economic situation of the country which cannot be repaired. But something is needed to do the repairing. A party is needed. But a party in the true sense of the word does not exist. There is an organization which formally excludes millions and millions of members and candidates. There is an organization which formally includes millions and millions of members and candidates. Both members and candidates have no rights. In the tight limits of the party, there are in fact the terrorized elements of two parties, the proletarian and the Thermidorian. Above them rises the bureaucracy. It bears the responsibility for the mistakes in economic policy, for the undermining of the, quote, Smichka. It bears a still heavier responsibility for choking the party. At the same time, as through its policy, it confronts hostilely the peasantry and the state. It has politically disarmed and split up the proletariat. Not only do the workers physically wander from one factory to another, but politically they, too, find no permanent place. It would be false to assume that the line of the Thermidorian split must pass between the Stalinist apparatus and the right wing of the party. No, it must pass through the apparatus itself. What percentage of Besedovskys and Agabakovs does it contain? That even the betrayers of tomorrow do not know. All depends on the relation of forces outside of the apparatus. It needs only a sufficient blow from the petty bourgeoisie for the bureaucratic Thermidorians to recognize themselves and to leap over the wall that separates them from the class enemy. Therein lies the third source of danger of Thermidor. But someone from the Stalinists or their admirers will say, quote, "Don't you see that the Central Committee is preparing to purge the party of the right-wingers? Just this proves that Stalin is taking measures against Thermidor," end quote. No, we will answer, quote, "the bureaucratic, quote, purging only facilitates the work of Thermidor," end quote. The new purging, like all those that have preceded it in the course of the past 10 years, will be directed primarily against the left opposition and in general against the thinking and the most critical proletarian elements, in spite of the official slogan, the quote, main danger, quote, in spite of the official slogan, quote, the main danger is to the right, end quote. Rykov, too, repeats this formulation now. Prisons and places of exile are being filled primarily with left oppositionists. Still, even when the blows fall on the right wing, they do not strengthen the party but weaken the party. Among the right wing, besides the truly Thermidorian elements, there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, who are profound enemies of capitalist restoration, but who demand the revision of the whole policy from the standpoint of the working masses in city and village. The program of these right-wingers is confused. They can for a time support Thermidor, but they can also support the revivification of the party by the revolutionary way. The Stalinist bureaucracy prevents them from understanding the situation. Through its, quote, purging, it endeavors first of all to choke off critical thinking, thereby it only strengthens the right wing. And who will do the purging? In Paris, Besedovsky led the commission that, quote, purged Rakovsky. Let us never forget this. Since then, the demoralization of the apparatus has gone further. In all the letters which we receive from the USSR, the most tragic note is this, quote, no one has confidence in another. Everyone is afraid that a class enemy with a party card is next to him, end quote. Louder than anyone else, the careerists, the adventurers, the Besedovskys, and the Agabakovs will shout about the necessity for a purging. Who will purge the party of these purgers? Not the apparatus, but only the irreconcilable enemies of the absolutism of the apparatus. Is the situation hopeless? Such words do not belong to our vocabulary. The struggle will decide. On the side of the proletarian revolution, there are many historical possibilities, negative possibilities, the dreadful decay of capitalism, the raging quarrels of the imperialists, the bankruptcy of reformism, as well as positive ones, the hardened cages of the Bolshevik-Leninists, understanding the course of development, clear perspectives. The struggle will decide. The danger has grown and has come nearer. That is absolutely unquestionable. But the poison of Thermidor carries within itself, too, the elements of the antidote. The more immediate and nearer the danger, the stronger becomes the need of resistance. The more the Stalinist bureaucracy loses its head, the more its omnipotence proves to be in the apparent power. The louder will be the demands of the advanced workers for a Bolshevik leadership. The last speech of Stalin, we come back to this, means a turn to the right. Every phrase of his bureaucratic boasting is only a concealed recognition of the falsehood of the whole, quote, general line, which has brought the dictatorship nearer to Thermidor. The diseases and dangers will be treated by Stalin through a new bureaucratic zigzag amidst redoubled bureaucratic terror. A redoubled struggle against Stalinism will be our answer. Trotsky, Prinkipo, 11th of January, 1933.